click subscribe and hit that 1 Samuel chapter 25. Now, Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. So here's a question for you. Who's Samuel? So Samuel is a prophet. He's the last judge of Israel. He is also leader of the prophets, of the school of the prophets in Ramah. Now, who is he to David? So he is a spiritual father to David. Samuel is the one who revealed God's will to David, who led him into his greatest steps in his life. He went from just being a little shepherd boy into the limelight under Samuel's tutelage. He is a friend to David. David fled to him in his time of need. When Saul was trying to pursue him, he ran away and fled to Samuel, and Samuel was his confidant. Samuel was mentor, his friend, his leader, his spiritual leader. And so Samuel dies. Samuel dies. He is also the leader of all Israel. So before there was a king, there was a judge, and that judge was Samuel. So he ruled over all of Israel. He led all of Israel against their enemies to fight and to arbitrate between people, to be a justice kind of instiller. And so he would go around preaching God's will and preaching the Torah and obedience to God. And so he dies, and everybody assembles. Everybody assembles and they mourn over him. And then we get in part B, so in verses, there's a section, a B section. There can be sometimes a C section. And so in B, it says, then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. So it's possible that David was there. It's possible that he went to mourn and to celebrate the life of Samuel. It's also possible that he didn't. It doesn't really tell us. It's kind of left in a gray area. I tend to believe that David went up. He went up with all of Israel, and they all went to Samuel, and Saul kind of left him alone, and he kind of just did his own thing. And then in verse 2 it says, and there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. So David left, he went into the wilderness of Paran, and now we have a movement forward in the story. And it's important to realize that we just left chapter 24. Saul was pursuing David. Saul was this close to being killed, but David spared him and gave him mercy. And he just cut the hem of his cloak. And then we get chapter 25, very drastic change in the story. Samuel dies. Samuel dies, and then now we have a story kind of off on its own. David is going to experience some things and go through some things, and he's not going to really react properly. He's not going to be the man that we would hope him to be, and he's definitely not the man that we just saw in chapter 24. He is a man in grief. He is a man at his wit's end. He is stressed, he is pressed, he is persecuted, he is crushed, and he's going to react wrong. He's going to get excited, and he's going to get angry. So we get this man in chapter 25, verse 2. There was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. Now the woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shears. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David. Verse 2 through 8, It's about David trying to find favor with this rich man. What we find is Nabal is based in Maon. Now, chapter 24 takes place there. David's been hiding there. And now he's up in Carmel. So Nabal is, 20 miles away with his sheep. They're having a big party. They're having a feast. And they're shearing the sheep. You know what does it mean to shear the sheep? Shave them down. Because sheep grow wool. You shave the wool off. You build product. So it's a factory. He's a businessman. And he's out doing business. Now David heard that he was there. So he sends his men up there to talk to him. Now, the narrator, the person who wrote this down so that we can understand what's going on, it tells us, here's this guy, here's David sending his men up there, but I want to give you some insider knowledge. It talks about two people. Who does it talk about? A husband and a wife, Nabal and Abigail. And what does the narrator say about those people? Nabal is an idiot who's rude and rash. He's harsh. He's ugly on the inside. Now, what about Abigail? She's discerning and she's beautiful. Now, that's going to be important to the story. So as we're reading the scripture, we want to pay attention. Like, well, why is it telling us these ideas? Or why is it giving us these facts? Because it's going to be important in just a minute. So David sends his men over there, and this is what he says to them. Peace, peace, peace. He very much says, it's almost like walking up and saying, the Lord bless you. May he bless your family. May he give you lots of children. And may the produce of your land be overflowing. David is there in a very respectful manner. He sends 10 men to talk to him. And he says, when you talk to him, be very respectful. So peace to you. And he says, I have been at business with your business. Your shepherds who are taking care of your flock. How big is this flock?
4,000 all together.
3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, 4,000 altogether. So David says, while your men were with us, we took care of them. And not only that, we didn't take anything from them. Now, why is that incredible? So what's the character of David's men? They're vagabonds. They're known as being discontented, being in debt, and kind of cornered, pressed. These are not the most upstanding people in society. And so David had to restrain them. David had to be like, no, we don't take what's not ours. It's like talking to a 5-year-old. I'm like, no, guys, we're not going to do that. In fact, David is a shepherd himself. He grew up tending to the sheep. He grew up doing those things. In my mind, he's got a really soft spot for these guys, and he's like, hey guys, you know what? Let's make their lives a little easier because I know how hard it is what they do. And so David is actually a great resource for them, and we're going to discover more information later. But by David's words, he says, look, we were there with your men. Talk to them and find out how we treated them. He doesn't try to assert his own background and to say, I've been so good to you. He just simply says, may the Lord bless you. We were with your men. Ask them how we treated them. Now, since you are having a feast, since you are going to be shearing the sheep and having this kind of holiday, we're asking that you would be gracious enough to give us some food. Now, what does it mean when you go up to somebody and you can't give them anything in return, but you're asking something from them? You're begging. This is humbling, right? This isn't a fun thing for David. This isn't an easy thing for David. He's just lost his mentor, his friend, and now he finds himself begging for food because he has 600 people to feed. He has a lot of responsibility upon him, and he humbles himself to ask. And he says, find favor in your son. Be gracious to me. And he humbles himself even under Nabal to say, you're my father and I'm your child. Be kind to us. And so that's where the story goes south. Everything's great until this point. Verse 9, it says, when David's young men came, they said all of this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. How long do you think they waited? We don't know. But what that means is that Nabal didn't just respond, he thought about it. So they went and talked to him and said, please give us some food. And Nabal's like, let me think for a second. And then he comes back and he gives them the answer. And he says in verse 10, and Nabal answered David's servants, who is David and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I don't know where? And so David's young men turned away and came back and told him all of this. Verse 13, and David said to his men, every man strap on his sword, and every man strapped on his sword. And David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. So while they were waiting, what we find out in verse 14 is that Nabal came back and actually started screaming at these guys. He started railing on them and chewing them up and down. And this is what he says, who is David? Now, does he know who David is? Yeah. Who is Jesse? He knows his dad. Who is Jesse? Does he know who Jesse is? And then he says, who are these men that I'm going to give my food to? It sounds innocent enough, like, oh, you're just asking who they are. But he knows who they are. It's pretty evident. So what is he implying? You're nobody, you're nothing, and you're going to get nothing. It's a very disrespectful response. And it gets worse because he says this, you are a servant who has broken away from your master. He says, there are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. It's almost like saying you're an insurrectionist. You are a servant of the king, and now you're doing your own thing and you're out there fighting against him. And so he charges him with capital crime. He charges him with being a bad servant and being rebellious. And so David takes kindly to that. And what's his response? He immediately says, everybody get your guns. That's what he says. Get your swords. And everybody gets their swords. And then he gets his sword. This is the impact of instant fury. They're wanderers, people who don't have a home. Do you guys struggle with anger at all? Anger is an interesting emotion. It's not always sinful. God is angry with the wicked every day, and God is holy and pure. So anger in and of itself is not a problem. It's when anger leads you to do evil things. So we got to recognize that the emotion itself is not terrible. It can actually be a good thing. Anger can be good. Somebody kidnaps somebody you love. Anger is going to drive you to get them back. It's an interesting emotion because the amount of energy that you get from anger is intoxicating. It's a drug in your system. When you feel the burn of anger and fury, your adrenaline pumps, your heart rate goes up, and some people black out and they don't remember what they do because they just lose all sense of reality because anger has filled them to that capacity. Now, I am not an angry person, but I know the emotion of anger. We all do. We all get angry at some point in our life, like that dude who treats you a certain way on the freeway. Right? We all know how that feels. What's the first emotion we're given for David in this chapter? He's grieved, he's sad, he's in sorrow, and then the next emotion is humility, being crushed, humiliated, having to beg for food, and then quickly after that, he gets anger, and he gets fury, and he gets frustration because of the disrespect of this guy. He wasn't just frustrated at Nabal, but he's frustrated at his entire situation. That's why this story is placed here in between Saul and his destruction, or Saul's attempted destruction of David, and now David's frustrations with Nabal. His life has gotten to its peak of frustrations, and this guy snaps, and he does what he does best. He goes out to war and to shed blood. David is known for killing people. That's what he's known for. Do you remember the song they sang? David kills tens of thousands of people. He is a man who sheds blood, and he does what he does best in anger. It's not a good judgment call. This isn't righteousness, and he's going to admit that in a moment. He is struggling with some stuff in his life, and he looks at his men who are also bloodthirsty. Like, remember how they wanted to kill Saul? They're like, dude, let's do this. These guys constantly ask, like, David, now's the time. He makes that judgment call, and he tells everybody, let's go. And so they leave. Verse 14. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields, as long as we went with them. And they were a wall to us by night and by day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. One of the men who was stationed with David, tending to the sheep, goes and talks to Abigail. And what does he say to her? Yeah, your husband's worthless and he's stupid. He just upset John Wick. He goes to her and he says, look, this is the story. David, his men, and your husband. And this is where he explains the response. This is an eyewitness who saw Nabal talking to this guy. And this is what he says. He screamed at them. This word railed at them is to just yell and express all of his frustration upon these men. Do you remember when he came out and he talked to him? He says, who are you? Where are you from? I'm not going to give you stuff. That's where we get that information. This man goes to his wife and is like, your husband has just kicked the hornet's nest. Now listen here. These men, they were good to us and they were honest, and we chose to go with them. What that means is David had his company of men and they were doing and living their lives. And these shepherds were like, the Philistines are over there and they're coming through the land and they're raiding, taking advantage of everybody. And here's 600 guys who are actually really kind, they're generous, and they're good to us. And get this, they're not stealing from us. They're not mistreating us. We stuck with them. And they were a fortress to us. They provided for us safety and security, and they helped us do our jobs to protect your husband's goods. David went out of his way to help these men, but David was humble enough to not even mention that to Nabal. That's where he told him, go talk to your men. And now Abigail's hearing this, and she finds out that disaster is going to befall them. Nabal will not listen. He is a man of zero discernment. We're going to contrast Nabal and Abigail. Nabal won't listen to anybody. He's proud, he's arrogant, he thinks of himself, only his own self-satisfaction, where Abigail considers consequences. She sees things afar off. She hears, she receives information, and she reacts. And so she, in verse 18 through 20, she hustles to find a solution. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, go on before me, behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. So she understood, she hustled, and she executed a plan. She did not have a lot of time to react. A lot of things have taken place here where David's men have already left. They could have already told David, and then harm was already coming their way, and she needed to generate proper responses under great pressure, literally threat of death. And she's like, this is what I'm going to do. Give this guy some food. Deal with his anger. This is what Jacob does with Esau. Jacob loads up all the food and the cattle, and he says, this is for you, Esau, this is for you, Esau. And then he came with his family, and then Esau's like, what is all this stuff? And it brought peace. There was an offering to bring peace. And so she does the same thing, and she rides up to meet him. Now, in verse 21, this is going to be fun. It says, now David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. What does he say there? So he invokes a curse in his anger, and he says, if I don't do this thing, curse the person who doesn't fulfill it. He gets so mad because he had actually tried really hard to do the right thing. And this is where his frustration comes in, because he wasn't just doing the right thing to do the right thing. He was doing the right thing to gain something in return. He was calculating in his mind, oh, Nabal's guys, okay, yeah, we'll take care of them. And then he owes me one. And then when he got that disrespectful response, David's like, man, it was useless. My good deed went unsatisfied. He is given evil for good, and my good behavior is in vain. This is where anger and other emotions that can tweak how we think, jealousy and envy and sadness, all of this bad thinking takes place with those emotions. That's why it's so dangerous to live in those emotions. So David is so frustrated and so angry that he doubts that God will justify those who do good, and he will punish those who do evil. Remember how we talked about last time how theology, the belief system that we have, is how we live our lives? David has forgotten the justice of God. David starts to take justice into his own hands, and he wants to justify himself in all of his good works and his good deeds. And he says, my actions were worthless, and now I will repay, says David. And I will kill every single man in that household. Why? He is going to obliterate his name. His family lineage will not exist. He wants to destroy him and everything that's important to him. That's how angry he is. It's not about just making a lesson out of him. It is to annihilate him. Verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. I got a little joke for you. This here is love at first sight. Abigail and David, this lovely story. She just runs over and flops on the ground. And it's dirt, by the way. It's dirt and it's sand and it's gravel. And she just lays flat on the ground and she's all dirty and messy. And he's like, wow, what a woman. She hurries and she falls down on the ground and she lays prostrate, face on the ground. Yeah, she fell before on her face and bowed to the ground. So here's the thing. It's humble yourself and rub your face in the dirt, or death. This is her response. She's like, there's only one thing that can solve this, and that's humility. That's the one thing Nabal can't do, but Abigail can. So she runs and falls on her face. Verse 24, she fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. So she says, I'm guilty. I'm the problem. Please let me talk to you and I will explain the situation to you. Verse 25, let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. So Nabal means idiot. She's like, don't regard this stupid idiot, because that's his name. His name means fool or idiot. She's trying to appeal to David and say, don't listen to stupid people. Don't let stupid people get to you. Let me talk to you. I wasn't there. Maybe we can work something out. Verse 26, now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. This is where her theology is coming out. What does she believe about God? God is alive. So she knows and believes that there is a God in heaven. A God who sees, a God who hears, and a God who reacts. He's alive. And she compares it to David. And she says, as the Lord lives, even as your own soul lives, God is keeping you from shedding innocent blood. God is restraining you from blood guilt, for being guilty for killing somebody wrongly, unjustly. And she refers to it as salvation, by bringing salvation of your own hands. What that means is delivering your own honor. You are trying to justify yourself with the bloodshed of Nabal, but God is alive and He is stopping you from honoring yourself, and let God be the judge of Nabal, and all of your enemies be like Nabal, because God is on your side and He will judge. That's her argument, and this is going to play out a little bit more. Verse 27, and now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant. Who's your servant? Who's she talking about? Herself. So she is actually presenting herself on behalf of the sinners. They made the mistake, but she's saying, I will be the payment. Put their debt on me and I will pay. That sounds like Jesus if I've ever heard of anything. She says, I will be the one to bear the punishment. Please forgive your servant. She is substituting them. She is becoming the substitute for Nabal, replacing him for herself. Because, verse 28, part B, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. She says, you're fighting for God. You don't need to fight for yourself. God is fighting for you. And she says that by saying, God will build your house, a sure house or a strong house. Leave it to the Lord, and you will be innocent. And there will be no guilt or evil found in you. Let the Lord handle it, and you will stay pure, is what she's saying. 29. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living, in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of the sling. So this is a picture. It carries the idea of people in the field gathering wheat, and they would bundle it up and they'd cut it and then they'd tie it up and they'd have a bundle. Wheat is a precious thing. It is substance, it is sustenance, it is food, it is wealth. And the idea is that David is bundled up, he's protected, and he's in the arms of the Lord. You will be a sheaf bundled in the Lord your God. And then she says your enemies will be like a stone in a sling that the Lord will swing and throw away. They will be cast far away from God. David, you will be in the arms of the Lord, but your enemies will be cast as one in the hollow of a sling. Verse 30, and when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you leader over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. So she says, God is going to make you the leader. God will make you chief. Now that's a revelation that most people aren't really talking about in Israel. So it's curious how she found that out. Either this has spread abroad because of David's men, or it's she has the insight and the discernment to understand, like, actually this is God's chosen man. He's just traveling in the wilderness for now. And she says, you will be the prince. And when God does that, you will be justified. You won't have to save yourself. You won't have to justify yourself. And you will have a clean conscience, because you will not have shed innocent blood. Remember me. When you become the king, remember your servant. Sounds like the thief next to Jesus. When you come into your kingdom, remember me, right? She says the same thing. When God delivers you, when God justifies you, when God puts you where you're supposed to be, you will be innocent, your conscience will be clean, and you will remember me. Just like Jonathan asked and made a covenant with David, just like Saul asked and made a covenant with David that he would be kind to their children and to their generations. So it sounds like she's doing the same thing. Verse 32. And so David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male. Then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition. David's response, he snaps out of it. He leaves behind his anger and his frustration, and he listens to her plea for mercy, her reason. David is not an unreasonable person. He just got caught in a bad situation. And now Abigail's foresight, Abigail's wisdom has calmed him down, and he says, thank God for you. He actually says this 3 times. He says, blessed is God, blessed is your discretion or your understanding, your wisdom, and blessed are you, Abigail, because God has used you to deliver me from my own sin. Now, the theology behind this is providence, that God is in control. God is moving in our world. We learned about sovereignty last time, and now we're learning about providence. Sovereignty is God has the choice, and providence is God is doing it. God has used Abigail to calm David down, and he is so grateful, and he says, thank you, Jesus. And you know what? You are a blessing. And the gift that God has given you is a blessing, because you stopped me from making a big, big mistake. Because if you hadn't, I would have destroyed you guys. He knew the outcome. He was able, with hindsight, 2020 hindsight, to look back and be like, man, I was so angry. And I was the man, I had murder in my heart, and I was going to do it. And you saved me, but it wasn't you, it was God in you. It was God working through you to help me, and I am blessed. And so he says, go in peace. You remember how he first started talking to Nabal? He said, peace, peace, peace. And then there was no peace. Bloodshed, and disaster were to befall him. And now at the end of it, because of her reaction, he can say peace. Where there is forgiveness of sins, the covering of transgressions, there can now be peace. And he says, go up to your house, you'll be fine. 36. And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal." And he kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. See, David acknowledged what he was going to do was wrong. And God was merciful to him and saved him. And not only that, but he rejoices in the justice of God. God was his avenger. God took out on Nabal what Nabal deserved. For years and years, I'm sure the Lord was patient and kind and long-suffering, and he was generous to Nabal. He was gracious to Nabal. But there came a day where Nabal's actions and choices were brought back to bear upon him, and God killed him. He stopped his heart and killed him. Grace will run out. So verse 36, Nabal was in false security. He had false happiness, and he was just merry. But why was he so merry? He was drunk. He was super wasted, partying, having a good old time. Like what? Like a king. He felt like he was strong. He was secure. He was capable. Do you know how he felt? Remember how he rallied and railed at the guys? Do you know what emotion he had when he was chewing out David's guys? Self-righteous. And he felt justified in his anger towards David. He felt like he had the right to put David in his place. And he stood up feeling like a big man who's talking to these 10 young men, and he says, "Your master and you guys, you've broken from your master, and who are you, and whatever." And he sends them away, and he treats them like dirt. And he felt strong about it. He felt good about it. He felt like nobody could correct him or stop him. It is the height of arrogance, the height of pride, and self-satisfaction. And it's a scary place to be. It happens in church quite a bit, where people feel like they can tell other people that they're dirt, where they feel like they're better than other people and can tell them that they need to be better and that they should be changing their actions and they should be doing certain things. So Nabal was self-righteous, self-entitled, and he was rich. So he felt like nobody could fight against him and nobody could stop him. He's surrounded by his servants. When he tells somebody to do something, they do it. And when he was presented with an opportunity, he flexed up and he felt good. It was empowering to him. And so he gets drunk. He thinks everything's great. And he didn't know. He had no idea that around the corner was a semi-truck coming right for him with zero chance of getting out of the way. Yet Abigail was cunning and smart and wise, and she hustles. She's a hustler. We're going to find out in just a second. She's a hustler. Her discretion saves the day, and she tells him what was going to happen. And what happens to him when he hears this? His heart dies. I tried to look this up in the Hebrew. It literally means what it says. It died. So he had a form of a heart attack and or a stroke. You can have a heart attack and actually survive. You can lose. My dad had a clogged artery, and he lost like 40% of the function of his heart, and the heart actually grew around it and helped supply blood to where it was needed. And so you can survive under a lot of crazy circumstances because God has engineered us to live and to survive. He became as a stone, right? He just like laid down. He's like, "Oh, I don't feel good. Oh, I gotta lay down." And when he laid down, he never woke up. And then eventually he died. And sometimes what that can be, even if your brain is dead, your lungs and your heart actually have their own nervous system, and they'll operate on their own, even if you're brain dead. He could have been functionally dead, yet his body could have been operating. So it took 10 days for him to die. David hears about this, and what does he say? Woo! Woo! He's rejoicing. He is just so excited. We don't look at that and be like, what a godly man. But here's the thing. We can rejoice in the justice of God. We can see that what God does is good. And when people get punished for what they do wrong, we can rejoice in that. We don't hope that our enemies will experience certain things. We don't pray that our enemies will experience certain things. But we have to recognize this, that there will come a day when everybody will stand before God and be held to give account. And He will hold them accountable to everything that they have ever thought. Every idea in their mind, they will be accountable. And so we can rejoice when God punishes evildoers, when He casts them into the lake of fire, because that is justice. We don't pray for that. We don't hope for that, but we can recognize that justice is served and we can clap and rejoice. It's the same way when you hear about these brutal crimes that people commit. When you hear about evil, wicked serial killers and they get caught and they get thrown in prison, you know what we do? We rejoice. We are so glad that that evil, terrible person is thrown in prison and they are getting what they deserve. But what we have to recognize is that is on the physical realm. God deals with the spiritual realm, which is every single thought and idea, and every single one of us is a serial killer. Every single one of us is a serial rapist and a serial adulterer, a serial liar. We are all worthy of being cast into hell. We are all worthy of being chained and thrown in prison. But now that we're saved and forgiven, and we find the forgiveness of God through the punishment of Christ, Jesus received our punishment. He was dealt our blows and our strikes. Now we can rejoice in seeing that our God is a just God who will bring recompense against every evildoer. There will be a day of justice, and we can hope in that, and we can have joy in that. And here's the great thing is even Nabal received grace and mercy. It's just one day he didn't. Right? We all receive grace and mercy until we don't. And that's the day of judgment. Right? It says that God's patience is so that we would repent. He gives us time and He shows us His mercy and His grace. And He says, I'm waiting for you to turn away from your sin and come to me. And when you do that, you'll find refuge. You'll find forgiveness because I've already paid your debt. I afflicted my Son to forgive you. So all you have to do is come to me and you will find the cleansing of your sins. You find that God is a good Father. If you don't come to Jesus, you find that He is a very strict judge. Verse 40 through 44, it's about a wife or 3 wives or 2 wives. A lot happens here in David's life. So verse 40, so David hears that Nabal died. So 39 verse B, then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife, right? Love at first sight. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, David has sent us to you to take you to him as his wife. And she rose and bowed her face to the ground and said, Behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail hurried, because she's a hustler, she hurried and rose and mounted on a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. Oh, by the way, verse 43, David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wife. Oh yeah, and Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Galim. So poor David is going through some things here. Abigail so impressed David that as soon as Nabal died, he immediately went to go rescue her. It doesn't always go well for widows in Israel. Not necessarily Israel, but in the ancient world, widowhood is probably one of the most fearful things of women in general, because you're left to the nearest male in the family. It could be your children who would love you, or it could be a servant who doesn't like you at all. And then you could get married out to somebody else or whatever takes place. David says, hey, you know what? I'm not going to leave you stranded. I'm going to take care of you, and I will be responsible for you. And he shelters her. He's like, you impressed me the day you hit your face on the ground. What a woman. And so he sends messengers. He says, go get her to be my wife. It's not like there's a lot of choice in this, primarily because it's the best, most logical option for her to choose. If she rejected it, she has a lot of possibility for a lot of really bad things to happen. So for David to come along and say, hey, I'll take care of you, I will make you my wife, she literally hustles, she hurries, she jumps up and she jumps on the donkey and she's like, I'm ready. Now she brings her servants, right? She brings her 5 ladies with her, like her best friends. These girls take care of her. They've been in her household and they come with her because they will be protected with her. Now, it just so happens David found another woman. We don't know who she is. She's Ahinoam of Jezreel, and she became his wife as well. And then, David already had a wife. Do you remember her in that story? The snare from Saul. So David fled. David's been gone for years. Where's his wife been? At home with the king, her father. And he remarried her to somebody else. He gave her away to somebody else because in their mind, David's dead. The king, Saul, has been seeking to literally murder him for so long. He's like, you're not married to David anymore. You're divorced from him and you're going to go marry some other dude. Now, again, it's to her benefit to be under somebody's protection, somebody's guidance. It wasn't so much what we think it is as like sex and kind of like having like a sex slave. It was having different roles for different women at different times. That's why you get concubines and all this different stuff. It's not fair. It's not a good thing for women. I'll tell you this, women have it now better than all of history, to be fair. But at that time, to be taken into somebody's household is a form of protection. They give you food, shelter, you can have family, you can have children. You have rights as a wife to have children, to bring forth heirs that are legitimate, not to have bastards or illegitimate children. See, concubines and prostitutes have illegitimate children, but to be an heir to the family, you'd have to be a child of one of the wives. So it's like a retirement plan. It's a great job. But if your husband's a fool like Nabal, you might just get killed. That's the risk you run. That's how we end the story. So here's a question for you. We want to talk about 3 characters we learned about tonight. We want to talk about Abigail, Nabal, and David. What applications have we learned from Abigail? Think quickly. Use discernment. She's not a procrastinator. I think maybe that's a good way of putting it. Is the opposite of procrastination is a quick response, a hurried, active response to execute a very good plan, not bad plans. Don't quickly execute bad plans, right? You need to actually make good decisions. She made good decisions. Okay, what about Nabal? What can we learn from Nabal? Yeah, pride is bad. Being respectful and honorable and not being rude. Pay back what others have done for you. Grace runs out. What about David? What do we learn from David? When your emotions are high, be mindful that your emotions are in control of you. David did not seek the Lord's will and decided to do it on his own. Having good people around you to help bring you down from an emotional problem, because our emotions get the best of us most of the time. Abigail was the voice of reason when David was not thinking straight. Nabal's man or servant couldn't talk to Nabal, so he went to somebody who would listen and somebody who had the power to do something about it. And so she was humble enough to receive information, to receive the situation, and then she had the wherewithal to react, and she instituted all of these steps forward. Okay, you do this, you do that, you do this, you do that. You guys all ship out and I'm right behind you. She is a servant of servants. Her response to the proposal was, I will wash, not David's feet, but I will wash the feet of David's servants. So she's humbling herself to be the servant to the servant. Now, she's been the queen of the empire, and she's going to be one of the queens of David's empire, but she says, I'll be down here. That's that humility you're talking about. And like a leader, she took responsibility. It was somebody else's fault. Her servants were at risk. But she took the responsibility to go herself instead of sending servants to talk to David. And she humbled herself and fell down on the ground and got all dirty and grimy and nasty. And I'm sure she was like crying. Doesn't say it, but I'm pretty sure she was crying. Abigail, she's smart, she's decisive, she's discerning. Now, discerning is the idea of being able to see. Right? If we say that somebody's discerning, it means that when you come to them and you have a conversation, they hear you. Now, I don't know about you guys, I have lots of conversations where we do not communicate. I say one thing, they say one thing, I get frustrated. They say I'm saying something, I'm not saying that. What are you saying? And we just don't see eye to eye. Being able to discern is to be able to see clearly either the situation or the communication that's taking place, or to read body language, or to understand where somebody's coming from, even if they're not really talking. That women tend to be pretty good with discernment. And she believed in providence. She believes in God. Her theology is actually really strong. Nabal's theology is practically an atheist. He's self-satisfied, self-sufficient, and he mistreats people. That's bad theology. You can see it in his actions, okay? So he's rude, he's proud, he's a drunkard. Let's just get that clear. Drunkenness is a problem. David, now maybe one of the most important points we can make tonight, David's temptation when he was at his weakest. David was at his weakest. And you know when that came? After his greatest strength. He had just overcome his enemy, and he had just found peace with his enemy. And then he was crushed with despair, crushed with sadness and humility and having to beg for food, and he lost his temper. And that's when temptation comes. It's right after the peak, in the deepest moment of your life. You can make mistakes and decisions that will wreck your life. It will go with you till your deathbed. And that is a scary thing to do. So David's example is to trust in the Lord, that God is going to put a barrier in between you. Now here's the thing. David could have ignored Abigail. David could have said, "Get away from me, you foolish woman." He could have done a lot of things, but what he did was he humbled himself. He humbled himself and recognized that he was the problem. And because he's the problem, that also means he's the solution. And he can change where he's at and move forward back into righteousness. David's strongest gifts, being a man of battle, became his greatest strength for evil. And that's a scary thought. That's somebody who's a great preacher turning around and preaching the anti-gospel. That's somebody who's a very charismatic person turns around and creates a cult and leads people into death. It's just somebody who's really good at doing something that God has given them, and they turn around and they use it for evil. And that's a sad thing to see. David was restrained by the Lord. That is a grace that we will never know the impact of. It says that the Holy Spirit is restraining the world. God is restraining so much sin in this world. We have a small concept of what this world is going to be like without Him. Read the book of Revelation and find out what it looks like when God is no longer holding back. When God allows people to do whatever they want, whenever they want, everything goes south fast. His providence, His grace, His mercy is actually stopping people from committing more and more sin, hurting more and more people. And thank God He does it with His saints, that He stops us from hurting and doing and regretting and making those sins and those mistakes a reality. Come back next week for 1 Samuel 26, David struggles, shame on you.